Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe now. You won't want to miss where this one goes. The man once feared by an entire country now sits alone in an 11-foot cell. No phone calls, no sunlight, no name that anyone outside says out loud anymore. They called him El Silencio, the man who never spoke, even when the whole world was listening. For a decade, he moved billions through borders no map could explain. Convoys vanished at his word. Judges disappeared from public life. Entire towns learned not to ask questions. Federal agents chased rumors of him for years. A shadow, never a face. Then, in a single night, the shadow became a man in handcuffs. What happened between his rise and his capture is still argued over in courtrooms and backrooms alike. Some call it justice finally catching up. Others call it a story too convenient to be the whole truth. Tonight, we go inside the walls where he now lives out his sentence. We speak with those who guarded him, those who feared him, those who still won't say his name on record. His story begins far from any prison, in a dust-colored village where poverty taught him one lesson early. Power protects. Weakness gets buried. By 19, he was already known to local police, not as a criminal yet, but as someone useful. He ran errands for men older and more dangerous than himself. He watched. He listened. He waited. Within 5 years, the boy who once had nothing controlled entire shipping routes. Money moved through him like water, finding its own level, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. But power like that never stays hidden for long. By his 30s, intelligence agencies on 2 continents had opened files with his name on them. Wiretaps, surveillance photos, informants who vanished before they could testify. Each piece of evidence built toward something larger, a manhunt that would stretch across a decade. And yet, for years, he remained untouchable, because somewhere, in rooms we may never fully understand, protection was being paid for. That question, who protected him, and why, still haunts investigators today. Some records were sealed, some witnesses recanted, some simply disappeared. What we do know is this: his fall, when it finally came, was faster than anyone expected, and what waited for him afterward was unlike anything he had ever prepared for. A cell with no view, a world with no visitors, a silence louder than any empire he once commanded. In the next chapter, we go inside the operation that finally closed in on him, and the informant whose testimony changed everything. Every empire has an ending written before anyone notices it beginning. For him, it started with a name investigators had heard for years, but never confirmed. An informant, close enough to know everything, desperate enough to talk. We'll call him the accountant. His real identity remains sealed under federal protection. For 18 months, he fed agents details no wiretap could ever capture. Meeting locations, payment structures, the names of men too powerful to ever be questioned publicly. Each report moved up a chain of command that grew more cautious with every page. Because everyone involved knew what had happened to informants before him. Some vanished quietly. Others turned up in headlines nobody wanted to read twice. The accountant understood the risk better than anyone. He took it anyway. Investigators built their case slowly, deliberately, terrified of moving too soon. One leak, one compromised officer, one rushed decision, and it would all collapse again. For years, that fear had proven justified. Previous operations had failed for exactly that reason. Corrupted communication lines, officials onto payrolls, operations that somehow always arrived just late. This time, the team changed its approach entirely. Smaller circles, compartmentalized information, almost no paper trail until the very end. Surveillance teams tracked patterns for months, vehicle routes, safe house rotations, communication windows. Slowly, a picture began to form of a man who trusted almost no one, except, it turned out, the few people closest to him: family, longtime associates, people who had known him since before the empire existed. It was one of those relationships that ultimately cracked first. A phone call, intercepted almost by chance, revealed a location no one expected. Agents moved within hours, aware the window might close as quickly as it opened. What followed was not the dramatic firefight often imagined in films. It was quiet, fast, almost anticlimactic, compared to the years that preceded it. No shootout, no explosion, just doors opening before anyone inside could react. He was found in a modest room, agents later said, Not a fortress. No bodyguards standing between him and capture. No last stand. Just silence. The man once surrounded by hundreds now faced arrest completely alone. For investigators who had chased him for over a decade, the moment felt almost unreal. One agent, speaking anonymously, described it simply: it didn't feel like victory. It felt like disbelief. But capture was only the beginning of a much longer, more complicated story, because arresting him and holding him were two very different challenges entirely. His history of escapes had already taught authorities one brutal lesson: walls alone were never enough to contain him. In the next chapter, we examine how a legal system built to be strong enough finally had to prove it. Capturing him had taken over a decade. Holding him would test the system even further, because this was not the first time he had been caught. Years earlier, he had been imprisoned once before, and the world assumed that was the end. It wasn't. Through a tunnel dug beneath a shower stall, he vanished without a trace. The passage stretched nearly a mile, engineered with lighting, ventilation, even a modified motorcycle. It wasn't an escape. It was infrastructure planned long before he ever needed it. That single event reshaped how authorities would treat him from that point forward. No prison, officials realized, could be trusted to hold him using conventional means alone. So when he was captured again, a very different process began. Extradition, a legal battle almost as complicated as the manhunt itself. Lawyers on both sides of the border fought for months over jurisdiction, evidence, and process. Diplomatic tension simmered beneath every hearing. Every delay felt deliberate to those watching closely. Human rights questions were raised. Conditions of confinement were challenged. Appeals were filed and refiled. Meanwhile, he remained in solitary confinement, isolated from any contact that might enable another escape. No visitors beyond legal counsel. No unmonitored communication. No routine that stayed predictable for long. Guards were rotated to prevent familiarity. Cells were changed without warning. Everyone involved understood the stakes of underestimating him twice. Eventually, after nearly a year of legal proceedings, a decision was reached. He would be extradited to face trial on foreign soil, away from the networks that once protected him. For prosecutors, it represented a chance no one thought possible, a trial beyond his reach. For his former associates, it meant something else entirely. Testimony was coming. Names were coming. For his family, it meant watching a public unraveling they could not stop or control. The flight that carried him out of the country was surrounded by extraordinary secrecy. Flight plans altered. Departure times withheld. Security details expanded far beyond normal protocol. One official later admitted, "We didn't believe it was real until the wheels left the ground." But even as one danger passed, investigators knew another had only just begun, because a trial meant witnesses. And witnesses, in his world, rarely lived to testify twice. As jury selection began, prosecutors received an anonymous warning through back channels. A witness scheduled to testify the following week had gone silent overnight. No calls, no messages, no confirmation of safety. And somewhere, in a courthouse preparing for the trial of the decade, one question hung over everything: would the case collapse before it even reached the stand? The silence lasted 3 days before answers began to surface. The missing witness, it turned out, had not disappeared by choice. Federal marshals found him in a motel 2 states away. Frightened but alive. He hadn't been threatened directly, he later explained. He had simply lost his nerve. "I kept thinking about what happened to the last one," he told investigators quietly. That single sentence spoke to something larger than one man's fear. A pattern. Prosecutors realized, stretching back years across multiple failed cases. Witnesses who recanted. Witnesses who vanished. Witnesses who simply stopped answering their phones. This trial, prosecutors understood, would only succeed if that pattern finally broke. So they built protections beyond anything used in previous cases. Relocation, new identities, constant surveillance for those willing to take the stand. Slowly, reluctantly, witnesses began coming forward again. Former associates, financial handlers, men who had once called him untouchable. Each one carried pieces of a puzzle prosecutors had spent years assembling. Testimony described logistics networks spanning multiple continents. Numbers so large that jurors reportedly asked to hear them repeated twice. But the most striking Testimony wasn't about money at all. It was about the ordinary mechanics of an extraordinary criminal operation, coded messages, loyalty tests, rules enforced with absolute and questioned authority. One witness described the atmosphere simply: "You didn't ask questions. You just survived." Defense attorneys pushed back hard, challenging credibility, memory, and motive. Every witness, they argued, had reason to lie in exchange for leniency. It became less a question of facts and more a battle over trust itself. Who could jurors believe when almost everyone testifying had once broken the law themselves? Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, public fascination reached levels rarely seen before. International media camped for weeks, waiting for details that rarely came. Court sketches became the only visual record allowed from inside. Cameras were banned. Phones were confiscated. Even reporters' notes were reviewed daily. The isolation extended to him personally, more than most trials ever require. Transported under heavy guard, held separately during every recess, never left unsupervised, even briefly, for a man once surrounded by loyal operatives. The trial revealed something quietly devastating. He now sat almost entirely alone, watching people he once trusted testify against him. One courtroom observer described his expression as unreadable, not defiant, not afraid, just still. As testimony neared its end, both sides prepared for what would follow, a verdict that would either confirm years of investigation or unravel everything built to reach this point. In the next chapter, we examine the verdict itself and the sentencing decision that would determine exactly where and how he would spend the rest of his life. After nearly 6 weeks of testimony, the jury began its deliberations. No cameras, no leaks, only silence from behind closed doors. For 3 days, the courthouse held its breath. Reporters speculated, analysts debated, families on both sides waited without answers. Then, on the 4th morning, word came that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled faster than officials expected. Every seat claimed within minutes. He was led in under the same heavy guard that had defined the entire trial. Witnesses later said he looked composed, almost detached from what was about to happen. The verdict, when read aloud, took less than 2 minutes to deliver. Guilty, on every count. For prosecutors who had spent over a decade building toward this moment, the reaction was restrained. There was no celebration, one investigator recalled, just exhaustion, and something close to relief. For those who had testified at great personal risk, the verdict meant something different entirely: vindication, but not safety. Many would live under new identities for years to come. Sentencing followed months later, delayed by additional legal motions and procedural appeals. The final decision, when it arrived, left little room for interpretation. Life imprisonment, without possibility of parole, served at the most secure facility in the country. At Florence, a name few outside law enforcement had heard before that day. Built specifically to hold prisoners considered too dangerous for conventional confinement. 23 hours a day in isolation. Reinforced concrete walls. No windows facing the outside world. For a man who had once escaped through a mile-long tunnel, the message was unmistakable. This time, there would be no infrastructure to exploit, no routine to study, no weakness to find. His arrival was handled with the same secrecy that had defined his extradition. No public transport records, no advance notice, no opportunity for anything to go wrong. Officials later confirmed only that he had arrived safely, and that intake had been completed without incident. From that point forward, information about his daily life became almost entirely sealed. Occasional court filings offered brief glimpses, a complaint here, a routine matter there, but the man once surrounded by wealth, power, and thousands of loyal operatives had effectively disappeared. Not through escape this time, through confinement so complete it resembled erasure. One former investigator, reflecting years later, offered a quiet observation: "We spent a decade trying to find him. Now no one will ever see him again." Whether that outcome represents justice, containment, or something more complicated remains a question many still debate. In our final chapter, we go inside the walls of ADX Florence itself and examine what life truly looks like for the man once considered untouchable. Somewhere inside a fortress of concrete and steel, a single door closes each night. Behind it, A man once feared across continents now lives in near total silence. ADX Florence was designed for exactly this purpose: containment without possibility of contact. No windows facing outward. No view of sky horizon, or anything down for walls. Meals delivered through slots. Recreation alone, and a space barely larger than the cell itself. Communication with the outside world reduced to rare, monitored, and heavily restricted exchanges. For a man who once commanded thousands, human contact now arrives only in fragments. Former prison officials, speaking generally about the facility, describe its purpose plainly. It isn't built to punish in the traditional sense, one said. It's built to remove possibility entirely. No tunnels to dig. No guards to bribe. No routine predictable enough to exploit. Every design choice reflects lessons learned from his previous escape. Years earlier. In that sense, his own history shaped the very walls now containing him. Legal filings occasionally surface, offering rare glimpses into his current conditions. Complaints about isolation. Requests for contact. The ordinary friction of confinement stretched across years. Little else is known, and by design, little else will likely ever be revealed. For investigators who spend over a decade pursuing him, the ending remains complicated. Justice, many say, was served, but questions about the systems that allowed his rise persist. How corruption enabled him for so long remains only partially answered. How many were protected, silenced, or lost along the way remains equally unclear. Some of those questions, officials admit, may never be fully resolved. What remains certain is the contrast at the center of this story. A man who once held unimaginable wealth and influence now holds almost nothing at all. No visitors beyond legal counsel. No empire beyond memory. No name spoken freely, even by guards. The tunnels, the convoys, the loyal networks, all of it reduced to a single silent room. For those who lived through his rise, the fall still feels almost unreal. Not because it happened, but because of how completely it erased everything that came before. Perhaps that is the final lesson of this story. Power, however vast, is never as permanent as it appears in the moment, and silence, in the end, can become its own kind of sentence. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it moved you, consider exploring more documentaries like this one. There are more stories waiting to be told.